A CEO follows his employee home after she asks for leftover food. What he discovers changes everything. Why would Maria Reyes ask for food when she works full-time? What secret is she hiding, and how far will Ethan Caldwell go to uncover the truth? You won't believe what he finds, and how it will challenge everything he thought he knew about his own company. Do you think Maria's secret will stay hidden? Will her CEO be able to fix this? Enjoy a cup of coffee, relax, and watch the full story unfold. Maria Reyes had been working at Café LA, a high-end restaurant in downtown Los Angeles, for nearly 2 years. The restaurant was famous for its gourmet dishes and vibrant atmosphere, always busy with customers and staff hustling to keep everything running smoothly. As one of the main line cooks, Maria worked late shifts preparing meals and ensuring everything was in order for dinner service. Maria was a hard worker, always punctual, never absent, and determined to support her family. She lived with her elderly mother and 2 younger siblings in a small apartment just a few miles away from the restaurant. The cost of living in Los Angeles was high, and no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough to make ends meet without struggle. After another exhausting 16-hour shift, Maria stood quietly in the back of the restaurant, wiping down her station. The other employees were finishing up, and the kitchen slowly emptied. Maria's manager, Eric, handed her a small brown paper bag filled with leftover food from the night. As she glanced at the bag, she felt a wave of guilt, knowing it was meant for her. But tonight, something was different. Maria hesitated before pulling out her phone and composing a message to the CEO, Daniel Mitchell. Subject: request for leftover food. Dear Mr. Mitchell, I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to inquire about the possibility of taking home any leftover meals after my shift. I'm currently facing some financial difficulties, and I would greatly appreciate it if I could take any food that would otherwise go to waste. It would really help me provide for my family. Thank you so much for your understanding. Best regards, Maria Reyes. Maria stared at the message for a moment, wondering if she was making a mistake. She had never asked for something like this before, and it felt wrong to reach out directly to someone at the top of the company for such a request. But the pressure had been mounting for weeks. The bills were piling up, her mother's health was declining, and Maria was doing everything she could to hold her family together. She hit send and felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. What if Daniel thought she was asking for too much? What if he judged her for it? The thought of being perceived as someone who couldn't even afford her own meals stung. As she tucked her phone back into her apron pocket, she walked to the back door, holding her brown paper bag tightly. She wasn't sure what kind of response she expected, but she couldn't deny the weight of the decision she had just made. Maria stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the city filling the streets around her. She walked quickly, her mind still racing. She had made the request out of desperation, but in her heart, she just wanted to ensure that her family wouldn't go to bed hungry tonight. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Her family depended on her. But even as she moved through the night, her thoughts kept drifting back to the email. Had she made a fool of herself? What would happen next? All Maria could do now was wait for the response, hoping it would bring the answer she so desperately needed. Daniel Mitchell sat in his corner office, surrounded by polished wood and city lights. It was late, the office quiet after another busy day, and the weight of his responsibilities pressed down on him. As CEO of Café LA, he had cultivated an image of precision, professionalism, and success. Every decision he made affected the restaurant's reputation, its standing in the city, its brand, and its clientele. His life revolved around maintaining this image. While reviewing reports, an email caught his attention. It was from Maria Reyes, one of the line cooks. The subject read, "Request for leftover food." He hesitated for a moment before opening it. Subject, "Request for leftover food, dear Mr. Mitchell. I hope this message finds you well. I'm writing to inquire about the possibility of taking home any leftover meals after my shift. I'm currently facing some financial difficulties, and I would greatly appreciate it if I could take any food that would otherwise go to waste. It would really help me provide for my family. Thank you so much for your understanding. Best regards, Maria Reyes." Daniel read through the email twice, trying to process it. His initial reaction was one of confusion and slight irritation. A formal request for leftover food, that was a first. Employees didn't make requests like this. They simply took food if they needed it or grabbed a bag of leftovers quietly. But Maria had asked in writing, an official request, as if she were entitled to it. The idea struck him as odd. He furrowed his brow. "Financial difficulties," she had written. Daniel couldn't understand it. His employees were well paid, and Café LA had always been a stable company. Maria, as a line cook, made a decent wage. If she was struggling, why hadn't she spoken up sooner or taken a different approach? Then his mind wandered to other possibilities. Maybe she has pets, he thought. Maybe she's asking for leftovers for them. After all, it wasn't uncommon for employees to bring home food for their pets. But still, it felt uncomfortable. This wasn't a restaurant for handing out food to employees on a regular basis. The resources were meant for the customers, not for personal use. His irritation grew. He didn't run a charity, and he certainly didn't want to start one, especially not for an employee he barely knew. Daniel had worked hard to establish a professional environment at Café LA. Where would it end if other employees began asking for food as well? He couldn't allow that. It wasn't just about food. It was about maintaining control and the right image. He shook his head and began typing a reply. His fingers were stiff, but precise as he crafted his message, trying to keep a professional tone despite his discomfort. Subject, request for leftover food. Maria, thank you for your message. While I understand that financial difficulties can be tough, we do not have a policy in place for employees to take home leftover food. The restaurant's resources are reserved for guests, and any unused food is disposed of according to health and safety regulations. I hope you understand. Best regards, Daniel Mitchell, CEO, Café LA. He clicked send and leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief. The issue was resolved in his mind, and he wouldn't think any more of it. The restaurant was a business, not a charity, and he had set the boundary. As he stared out at the twinkling city below, a slight unease lingered in the back of his mind. Something about Maria's request didn't sit right with him, but he pushed the feeling aside. Tomorrow, there would be new challenges to face, and this would be forgotten. But little did Daniel know, this was just the beginning. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the glow of his laptop screen. His mind kept returning to the email from Maria. Even though he had dismissed it and sent his response, something gnawed at him. It wasn't just the request that bothered him. It was the feeling that there was more to Maria's situation than she had let on. Financial difficulties. He couldn't quite make sense of it. She worked hard, showed up every day, and did her job without complaint. Yet here she was, asking for leftover food as if it were a lifeline. As he pondered this, a thought crossed his mind, one that he hadn't initially entertained. What if Maria wasn't just asking for leftovers for herself? What if there was something else going on in her life that she wasn't revealing? The nagging feeling that he might have misjudged her lingered. Daniel wasn't the type to become personally involved with his employees. He had built his career on the principle of keeping business and personal life separate. But something about Maria's request stuck with him. He decided, almost impulsively, that he needed to know more. What kind of person would make such a request? What kind of life did she lead outside the restaurant? He glanced at the clock. Maria's shift was nearly over. His curiosity got the better of him. Without thinking it through, he grabbed his coat, shut down his laptop, and left his office. It was a cool evening when Daniel stepped outside, the city's bright lights casting long shadows across the streets. The usual bustling noise of Los Angeles had quieted down by now, and the roads were emptier. Daniel slid into his black sedan, the engine starting with a low rumble. His heart wasn't racing, but there was a strange unease inside him, a mix of curiosity and something else, something he couldn't place. He drove toward the restaurant's back entrance where the staff parked their cars. It wasn't far from his office, but he kept his distance, not wanting to draw attention to his presence. He sat parked for a few minutes, scanning the parking lot, waiting for Maria to come out. Finally, he saw her. Maria emerged from the back door of the restaurant, the same small brown paper bag under her arm. She was wiping her hands on her apron as she walked briskly toward the bus stop. She didn't seem to notice him as she passed by, focused on the ground, clearly exhausted from the long shift. Daniel's curiosity deepened as he followed her from a distance, careful not to get too close. He watched her board the bus, taking a seat near the back. It was a long ride, one that Daniel didn't anticipate would be as lengthy as it was. The route passed through several neighborhoods Daniel didn't recognize, areas that seemed far removed from the upscale part of town where Café LA stood. The streetlights grew sparser, and the buildings became older, more rundown. At each stop, Maria didn't get off, and Daniel began to wonder just how far she was traveling. He kept his distance, careful not to draw attention to himself, but the unease inside him grew with every block. Where was she going? And why hadn't she taken a taxi or a rideshare like most people in her position would? Why the bus? The bus ride stretched on, longer than Daniel expected. The city skyline gradually disappeared from the rearview mirror, replaced by worn-down houses, chain-link fences, and empty lots. The further they went, the more Daniel felt the difference between his life and Maria's. It was a stark contrast, one that seemed to deepen with every turn the bus took. Finally, at almost midnight, Maria pulled the yellow cord, signaling her stop. Daniel kept his distance as she exited, staying in his car parked a few blocks away. He waited, watching her walk down the street, her steps purposeful but slow. She didn't look around, didn't glance over her shoulder. She walked with her head slightly down, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. He followed her, keeping several cars behind, trying to remain unnoticed. Maria didn't slow down. She walked through the dimly lit streets, her destination clearly in sight. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. It wasn't the kind of place Daniel expected to see someone like Maria, a hard-working, reliable employee living in. Maria turned the corner, and Daniel's heart sank when he saw where she was headed. It wasn't an apartment building or a small house, as he had imagined. Instead, she walked up to a dilapidated trailer, tucked away at the end of a street lined with other rundown trailers and small homes. The paint was chipped, and the exterior looked as though it had weathered years of neglect. Maria unlocked the door and stepped inside, her tired movements revealing the weight of the day. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat as he sat parked across the street, staring at the scene before him. He had thought he knew what her life was like, but this was something entirely different. He had no idea. He waited for several minutes, watching the lights flicker on inside the trailer. Through the thin curtains, he could just make out the silhouette of Maria moving around inside. The door remained open for just a moment, enough for Daniel to see the dim interior, cluttered, worn down with no signs of luxury, no decoration. It was a far cry from the comfortable, well-appointed life he led. As he sat there, he realized that he had no idea what Maria's life was like outside the walls of the restaurant. The email, the request for leftover food, had been a glimpse, nothing more. But what he had just witnessed was something entirely different. Maria wasn't just another employee struggling to make ends meet. She was a woman with a family to care for, living in conditions that Daniel couldn't have imagined. His mind began to race. He had assumed, judged, and dismissed her request without knowing the full story. As the minutes passed, Daniel couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of guilt that settled in his chest. What kind of person had he been to make assumptions without understanding the depth of her situation? He had to know more. He had to understand. But for now, all he could do was sit in his car, staring at the dim light in the trailer, realizing that his view of Maria had just been completely turned upside down. Daniel sat in his car, parked a few houses down from the trailer where Maria had just entered. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He hadn't planned on staying long, but something inside him urged him to stay to watch. A quiet dread settled over him as the minutes passed. The neighborhood felt strangely still, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something deeply personal. He turned his eyes to the trailer, trying to peer through the cracked windows. For a moment, the world outside seemed to disappear. All that existed was Maria's life, this small, humble space she called home. The light flickered inside, and he could see her moving about, though the details were unclear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Maria emerged from the trailer. She was carrying a small brown paper bag, identical to the one she had taken from the restaurant earlier. She walked down the dirt path to the trailer's door, but before she closed it behind her, Daniel noticed 3 small figures rushing toward her from the dimly lit interior. A boy, no older than 10, was the first to reach her. He wrapped his arms around her waist and she bent down, laughing softly as she kissed the top of his head. Then a girl a little younger ran up to her, hugging her leg tightly. Behind them, a frail woman stepped out, Maria's mother. She looked older than her years, her back hunched, her hair streaked with gray. She shuffled toward Maria, leaning on a walker for support. Daniel's heart clenched in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. It wasn't just the sight of Maria's family, this small, tight-knit group clinging to each other in the quiet of the night. It was the way she moved, the way she seemed to hold everything together. Maria didn't say much, but her actions spoke volumes. She handed the brown paper bag to her brother, who eagerly opened it. The children huddled around the counter, eyes wide with anticipation as they took the food from her. Maria, however, remained standing, her smile masking the exhaustion that was written all over her face. She didn't sit down. She didn't eat. She stood there, watching her family dig into the food she had brought home. Daniel watched this, his breath catching in his throat. Maria wasn't eating. She was giving up her own food to make sure that her family had enough to eat. The children gobbled up their portions with a hunger Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. The grandmother ate slowly, carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she brought the food to her mouth. Maria continued to stand by the counter, her eyes soft with affection for her family, but her shoulders slumped with weariness. Something in Daniel's chest tightened, a wave of guilt crashing over him. He couldn't look away from the scene. He had assumed, no, judged Maria for her request. He had thought she was just trying to take advantage to get a free meal, but now he saw the truth. She wasn't asking for food for herself. She was sacrificing her own needs to ensure that the people she loved didn't go hungry. He could feel the weight of her sacrifice in the air. Maria wasn't just a line cook at a high-end restaurant. She was a mother, a daughter, a caregiver. She was someone who lived in constant service to others, pushing aside her own needs for the sake of her family. And here she was, standing in a kitchen that was barely large enough to fit the four of them, trying to make sure they had enough food for the night. Daniel's thoughts raced as he watched the children finish their meal. Maria didn't sit with them. She didn't touch her plate, didn't take a bite. She cut her food into smaller pieces and pushed it around with her fork, making sure it looked like she had eaten. It was clear that she wasn't hungry, not in the way her family was. She was pretending for them, pretending that she had everything under control, that everything was okay. A sudden pang of realization hit Daniel. She hadn't just been skipping meals. This was a pattern. Maria had likely been doing this for weeks, maybe even longer. She had been putting her family's needs before her own, every day, every night, never complaining, never asking for help. She had worked double shifts, kept her head down, and tried to make ends meet. And yet, here she was, in a trailer too small for her family, struggling to make sure they had enough to eat. Daniel felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had dismissed her request, written it off as insignificant, as if it didn't matter. But it mattered. It mattered more than he had ever realized. Maria wasn't just a struggling employee asking for leftovers. She was a woman doing whatever it took to care for her family, no matter the cost to herself. As Maria finished pretending to eat, she helped her mother into a chair, her hands gentle as she guided her. The children were already yawning, rubbing their eyes, ready for bed. Maria cleared the dishes without a word, moving quietly around the cramped kitchen, her movements methodical but tired. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was simply doing what needed to be done. It was then that Daniel noticed something that made his stomach churn. The trailer was small, too small for 4 people. The furniture was sparse, and the walls were bare, with no signs of personal touches. There was no comfort here, no luxury, just survival. The most shocking part was the small mattress tucked into the corner near the kitchen. It wasn't a bed, just a thin mattress with a single blanket folded neatly at the edge. This was where Maria slept, on a mattress that looked more like a cushion. A bare minimum after working double shifts, cooking meals for strangers all day. The reality of Maria's life hit Daniel like a slap to the face. His own life, his lavish home, his fancy office, his expensive meals, all of it seemed like a distant memory now. Here she was, a woman working harder than he ever had to just to make sure her family didn't go hungry. And yet he had been blind to it. He sat in his car, staring at the trailer, his chest tight with guilt. He had no idea. He had never thought to ask, to look deeper, to understand. He had assumed too quickly, too harshly. He had failed her and all the employees like her by not seeing the truth. Maria wasn't asking for a handout. She was asking for a way to survive, and he had turned his back on her. The realization hit Daniel hard, and for the first time in a long time, he felt powerless. He had made a judgment based on assumptions, and now he could see the consequences of his actions. What would he do now? How could he make it right? Daniel sat in his car, staring at the trailer where Maria had entered just moments ago. The scene he had just witnessed played over and over in his mind, Maria, standing quietly by the counter, making sure her family had enough to eat while she ate nothing. The children devoured the food hungrily, while the elderly woman, Maria's mother, ate slowly, savoring what little she could manage. And there Maria stood, her tired eyes hiding the exhaustion she had worn like a second skin for so long. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as a wave of guilt hit him. He had dismissed Maria's request so quickly, assuming it was a simple plea for free food. But now, seeing her life for what it truly was, Daniel felt like a fool. He had misjudged her. He had been so caught up in his world of high-end restaurants and polished reputations that he hadn't considered the lives of the people working for him. Maria wasn't just a line cook. She was a mother, a daughter, a caregiver, sacrificing everything for the people she loved. Daniel's stomach churned as he thought about how quickly he had made assumptions about her. He had rejected her request without a second thought, not once stopping to consider the struggles she was facing. All of his decisions, his carefully constructed image of professionalism, had blinded him to the realities of those who worked beneath him. His thoughts swirled in confusion and shame. The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. Maria wasn't asking for charity, she was asking for survival, and here he was, dismissing her plea as if it didn't matter. The more he thought about the way she had stood by the counter, pretending to eat so her family wouldn't worry, the more his guilt deepened. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about food or leftovers. It was about respect, about seeing people for who they truly were. He had failed to see Maria, not as an employee but as a person, and in doing so he had failed to see the depth of her sacrifices. There was no excuse for his behavior. He had been wrong, and now he had to make it right. With a sense of urgency, Daniel grabbed his phone and quickly typed out a message to his head of operations. Subject: immediate action on employee welfare. We need to make changes, immediately. No employee should ever go home hungry. From now on, I want a new policy in place: food for employees, better wages, and support for those who are struggling. No one should have to ask for leftovers to feed their family. We're a family-oriented company, and it's time we start acting like it. I'll be in tomorrow to discuss details. Let's get this done. Best, Daniel Mitchell, CEO, Cafe LA. He hit send and sat back in his seat. His mind was still racing, but now there was a sense of purpose in the air. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could change the future. He had to. Maria deserved better, and so did the rest of his employees. He had failed them by not seeing their struggles, and he wasn't going to let that continue. As he started the engine and drove back to his office, Daniel felt a sense of determination take root. He had made a promise to himself and to Maria that he would do better, not just for her, but for everyone who worked for him. The guilt still lingered, but now it was mixed with resolve. He would make this right. And this time, he would be the leader they needed him to be. The next morning, Daniel walked into his office with renewed determination. He had spent the night reflecting on his actions and knew what needed to be done. His usual focus on efficiency and profits had blinded him to the real needs of his employees, and now it was time to change that. Without wasting time, Daniel called an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team. The room was filled with confusion, but Daniel spoke clearly and decisively. We need to overhaul our employee welfare policies. Too often, we focus solely on profits and overlook the very people who make this business successful, Daniel began. I've made a mistake and I'm going to fix it. No employee should have to choose between food and rent. We're implementing new policies to ensure everyone here is treated with respect. The HR manager, Sarah, raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you proposing, Daniel? Daniel's tone was firm. First, we're going to start a food program. Any leftover meals from the restaurant that are safe to distribute will be packaged and made available for our employees to take home. This will help those who are struggling, and it will reduce food waste. There was a brief pause before Sarah spoke. And what about wages? How can we ensure employees are paid enough? I've already instructed HR to review all full-time employee wages, Daniel replied. No one should have to work 2 jobs just to survive. We will adjust wages to reflect the cost of living. If our employees can't afford basic needs, then we've failed. Jack, the head of operations, frowned. This is going to be a significant financial burden. Are you sure we can afford this? Daniel met his gaze, unwavering. We can't afford not to do this. Our employees are our most important asset. If we want long-term success, we need to invest in them. This is about building a sustainable, compassionate company. The conversation shifted to other issues, and soon, Daniel proposed a third initiative, an emergency assistance program for employees facing hardships. If an employee is in financial crisis, they shouldn't have to face it alone. We'll create a fund to help in times of need. There was a moment of silence as the leadership team absorbed Daniel's words. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. This will take some time to implement, but I believe it's the right move. By the end of the meeting, Daniel had laid out a plan for immediate action. He wanted these policies in place within days. No more delays. He would communicate these changes to the entire staff during their next meeting, ensuring they knew their needs would be addressed. As Daniel walked through the kitchen later that day, he saw Maria at her station, diligently preparing food. She didn't notice him at first, her focus entirely on the task at hand. For a moment, he simply watched her, seeing her not as an employee but as a person, a woman working tirelessly to support her family. It hit him harder than before he had failed her. "Maria," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, surprised, but quickly masked it with her usual professionalism. "Yes, Mr. Mitchell." "I owe you an apology," Daniel began, his words sincere. "I misjudged you. I didn't see what you were going through, and I'm sorry. I've made some changes. We're going to make sure everyone here gets the support they deserve. You won't have to struggle alone." Maria blinked, processing his words. For a brief moment, Daniel saw her guard drop, and a small, grateful smile tugged at her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," she replied, her voice quiet but full of relief. As Daniel left the kitchen, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The changes he had made were just the beginning, but for the first time, he felt that he was leading with purpose. He had made a commitment to his employees, one he would keep. As the weeks passed, Daniel's decision to change the company's policies began to take root. The new food program was up and running, with leftovers now being distributed to employees who needed them. The salary adjustments were rolled out quickly, ensuring that no full-time employee had to choose between basic necessities and their work. The emergency assistance program was also launched, offering financial support to those facing sudden hardships. The changes were met with gratitude and relief from the staff. Daniel saw a difference in the way people interacted with him, not with the distant politeness of employees to their boss, but with a genuine respect and appreciation. It wasn't just the policies that had changed, it was the culture of the company. People began to feel seen, heard, and valued, not as tools to drive profits, but as individuals who mattered. Daniel found himself looking at his employees differently. He wasn't just the CEO anymore. He was a leader, someone who had learned the value of empathy and social responsibility. For the first time, he understood that leadership wasn't about maintaining control or projecting power. It was about understanding and supporting the people who helped build the company's success. Maria, in particular, seemed to breathe easier. The pressure that had weighed her down for so long, the anxiety of never knowing if her family would have enough to eat, seemed to lift. Her smile was more genuine, her movements less weary. Daniel had noticed that she even began to interact more with her coworkers, laughing and sharing moments that had previously been absent from her life. One afternoon, as Daniel walked through the kitchen, Maria caught his eye. She smiled at him, and this time it wasn't a forced smile. It was real. He returned the smile, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had both come. But the lesson Daniel learned was deeper than just making adjustments to wages or food policies. The true lesson was about understanding, about seeing people as more than just employees or workers, but as human beings with struggles, dreams, and lives outside the office. He had spent years building a successful business, but it wasn't until he understood the lives of those who worked for him that he truly grasped what leadership meant. He had learned that when you care about people, truly care. It creates an environment where success is no longer just about profits, but about creating something bigger. This lesson wasn't just applicable in the workplace. It was one that could be carried into everyday life. How often do we walk past someone, too caught up in our own problems to notice what they might be going through? How often do we assume that someone's struggles are just part of their job, part of their life, without considering the deeper challenges they face? Daniel had learned that everyone is fighting battles we cannot see, and sometimes a small act of understanding, a moment of empathy, can change everything. The changes Daniel made at Café LA weren't just about policy. They were about cultivating a sense of responsibility to his employees, to his community, and ultimately to himself. The restaurant was more than just a place to eat. It became a place where people could feel secure, where their needs were recognized and respected. As Daniel walked through the now quiet kitchen one evening, he realized that the real success of his business wasn't just reflected in the number of reservations or the reputation of the restaurant. It was reflected in the smiles of his employees, in their sense of security, and in the knowledge that they were not alone. That, he realized, was the true measure of success. And so, with a deep sense of fulfillment, Daniel knew that he had learned the most important lesson of all. Leadership is not about what you achieve, but how you uplift others.